Life out here has a way of teaching you patience. The fields don't rush for anyone, and the seasons keep their own stubborn schedule. No matter how badly you want spring to arrive or winter to pass. My days were measured in the creak of the barn door, the smell of fresh-cut hay, and the sound of my boots crunching over gravel. For years, that quiet rhythm had been my proof that the world, for all its chaos elsewhere, still made sense in my corner of it. I'd bought this plot of land nearly 2 decades ago, 10 acres of rolling pasture, bordered by a split-rail fence on one side and a thick tree line on the other. I knew every dip in the earth, every stubborn weed that refused to die, and every wildflower patch that popped up in spring like they'd been painted there overnight. It wasn't much in the eyes of city folks, but it was mine, and the kind of mine you feel down in your bones. Out here, ownership isn't just about paperwork or a name on a deed. It's the long hours you've spent mending fences in the heat, the backaches from stacking firewood, and the way you learn to read the soil like an old friend's face. That land and I had an unspoken agreement I'd take care of it, and, in return, it would take care of me. But that agreement started to crumble the day I wandered down to my southern boundary fence. I hadn't been that far in a while. The pasture there wasn't my best, and I'd been focusing most of my work closer to the barn. I was mostly checking for storm damage. Last week's wind had howled through here like it had a grudge. But I noticed something odd even before I got close. The first thing that caught my eye was the fence, or rather, the absence of it. A whole stretch was gone, like it had never been there. In its place stood a neat gravel driveway that I most certainly hadn't put in. The gravel was fresh, bright, and clean, like it had just been poured, and it stretched down the slope into a patch of my land that used to be dotted with wild blackberry bushes. Now, instead of brambles and weeds, I saw a flat, leveled pad of dirt, and beyond that, the skeleton of a building rising up where my pasture used to breathe in the sun. It took a moment for my mind to make sense of it. The framework was big. Too big for a shed, too fancy for a barn. The wood looked new, pale and fresh, and there were workers moving around it like ants around a mound. The clang of hammers and the hum of a generator carried in the morning air. This wasn't some small mistake. This was a project, a big one, and the location, smack in the middle of my land. There's a strange kind of quiet that comes when you're too shocked to be angry. The kind where you're not even sure what you're looking at, because your brain keeps insisting it can't be real. How I stood there for a good long while, boots planted in the grass, watching strangers build something on what I'd spent years calling mine. I'd never had trouble with neighbors before. Out here, most people respected boundaries, not just the kind marked by fences, but the invisible ones that come from living close to the land. It wasn't the sort of place where someone accidentally built on your property. Folks around here knew better than to test that kind of luck. But this wasn't just any neighbor. A few weeks back, I'd heard rumors that the HOA from the newer subdivision across the road had elected a new president. They'd been getting more aggressive about neighborhood improvement, though their neighborhood was really just a cluster of oversized houses pretending to be rural. I'd ignored them, figuring my land was outside their reach. What business would they have with a farmer and his pasture? Apparently, more than I thought, the structure taking shape before me wasn't just any house, it was shaping up to be a mansion. Wide foundation, tall supports, and the beginnings of a wraparound porch. Whoever was behind it wasn't building a weekend getaway. They were putting down roots, and they were doing it on my soil. The more I stared, the more I noticed the little signs of entitlement, the kind that don't come from necessity, but from the belief that the world is yours for the taking. The workers' trucks were parked in a neat row along the gravel, some of them with shiny HOA parking stickers in the windshield. The land had been cleared with a precision that spoke of hired surveyors, not guesswork. And strangest of all, there, was already a decorative gatepost installed at the head of the drive, as if the person behind this thought they could brand my property as theirs before the roof was even up. I felt the weight of years pressing in on me. All the mornings I'd risen before sunrise to tend this place, all the sweat I'd poured into it. And now, in some HOA president's mind, it was simply a blank canvas for their dream palace. Standing there, I couldn't help but think of my grandfather, who taught me the value of holding on to what was yours. He used to say that land is the one thing they aren't making more of, and once you let it slip away, whether through laziness, carelessness, or someone else's greed, you might never get it back. I didn't know the details yet. How they thought they had the right, or what twisted paperwork might have been filed to make this seem legitimate. But I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a takeover. The wind picked up, rattling the leaves in the nearby trees. Somewhere down the slope, a nail gun fired in quick bursts, each one driving the point home that this was no passing nuisance. Every sound from that site felt like an insult, not loud enough to be deafening, but constant enough to wear at you like a dripping faucet. By the time I turned back toward my house, my steps felt heavier than they had in years. Not from age or fatigue, but from the knowledge that the quiet life I'd worked for was about to be dragged into a fight I hadn't asked for. The pasture would never look the same again, even if I got it back. And deep down, I already knew I'd have to get it back, not for the money, not even for the land itself, but because of the principle. That's the thing about living out here. You can forgive a lot: bad weather, hard luck, the occasional fence that falls in a storm. But what you don't forgive is someone who walks onto your land like it's theirs and builds a castle without so much as a glance in your direction. This wasn't just the day I found out my land wasn't mine anymore. This was the day the clock started ticking on a fight I hadn't planned for, a fight I wasn't going to lose. The following morning, I took my coffee out to the porch like I always do. Normally, it's my moment of peace, the kind where you listen to the wind stirring the grass, let the steam curl up from your mug until the day feels ready to begin. But that morning, the view felt wrong. The horizon line, which for years had been a neat slope of pasture rolling into the tree line, now had an interruption. From my porch, I could just see the top of the structure that had invaded my land. Yesterday, it had been nothing more than the skeleton of a house. Overnight, the frame seemed to have doubled in size, as if it were growing in the dark while no one was watching. The beams were taller, the outline sharper. Even from a distance, I could tell it wasn't just a house, it was a statement. A mansion designed to announce, I own this place, whether it was true or not. Out here, you notice the speed of change. Things usually move slow. Grass grows in inches. Barns lean gradually, and fences rot over years. But this mansion was rising like a crop that didn't bother with seasons. That kind of speed only comes when someone's throwing serious money at a project. Curiosity pulled me back down toward the site. As I crossed the pasture, I could see that yesterday's gravel drive now had fresh tire tracks. Like a parade of trucks had come and gone before I'd even woken up. The scent of sawdust was sharp in the air, mingled with the faint whiff of diesel. It was the smell of progress, but not the kind that belongs on farmland. The workers were moving with a kind of efficiency. You see, when someone's footing a generous bill, they weren't local boys either. No weathered caps, no sunburned necks, no slow pauses to swig from a bottle of water and trade a story. These were crew members from out of town, fast, precise, and utterly uninterested in anything but the blueprints in their hands. They measured twice, cut once, and ignored the ground they stood on as if it were just another lot in a city grid. Beyond them, I could see what was left of my southern fence piled neatly to one side, the posts stacked like firewood. I knew exactly how deep I'd sunk those posts when I'd built that section. and seeing them ripped out with such casual precision put a knot in my gut. It wasn't the destruction that bothered me. A good storm can take down a fence, and you can always rebuild. It was the ease with which they'd erased my boundary, as if it had never existed in the first place. The mansion's foundation was now taking a more defined shape. Concrete footings had been poured, and there were outlines for multiple wings branching out like the arms of some sprawling creature. The porch was already framed, running the full width of what would soon be a grand facade. Whoever was behind this wasn't just building big, they were building to impress. The more I looked, the more I realized this wasn't just a home. It was a declaration of dominance, a kind of architectural flag planted in the soil to say, "I'm in charge now." That's when I noticed the signs. Literal signs, laminated sheets nailed to wooden stakes along the edge of the gravel. They had bold print that I could read even from a distance. Private property, no trespassing. HOA enforcement in effect. The audacity of it hit me like a cold wind. Not only was the house on my land, but the HOA president had already decided it was under her protection. I thought about the subdivision across the road. Those shiny houses with perfect lawns and mailboxes that all matched like they'd been ordered from the same catalog. They were nice enough in their own sterile way, but they didn't belong here, and neither did this mansion. Out here, houses grow with the land. They're built to weather storms, to face the sun in the right direction, to blend into the seasons. This place being built on my pasture looked like it had been ripped straight from a glossy magazine and dropped into the dirt without a second thought. Over the next week, I watched the project swell like a thunderhead on the horizon. Every day, something new appeared. Roof trusses, window frames, brick pallets stacked in perfect towers. The pace was relentless. Crews came and went like clockwork, leaving behind the smell of fresh lumber and the thud of heavy boots on plywood. I noticed other things too. A brand new black SUV started showing up in the afternoons, pulling right up the gravel drive and stopping at the edge of the work zone. The driver never got out while I was there, but I could see her through the tinted window, a woman with sharp posture and a clipboard in hand. She'd sit there for a few minutes, making notes, pointing once or twice, and then the crew would adjust their work as if she were royalty overseeing her. Castle's construction. It didn't take much guessing to figure out who she was. HOA presidents have a certain air about them, the kind that says, "I expect rules to bend for me." And here she was, not just bending them, but snapping them clean in half and building her mansion on top of the pieces. Her presence turned the whole scene from surreal to infuriating. It was one thing to have an unknown developer encroach on your land. It was another to see the face of the person who thought they could pull it off without so much as a knock on your door. The strangest part was how quickly the land itself seemed to change under her influence. The open pasture I'd known for years was vanishing beneath the construction. Grass was replaced with packed dirt, dirt replaced with concrete, and concrete replaced with imported landscaping stone. The soundscape changed to where once there'd been birdsong and the rustle of wind in the grass. Now there was the buzz of saws, the rhythmic slam of hammers, and the occasional bark of orders from the foreman. In the evenings, when the crews left, I'd sometimes walk down to the site just to remind myself what used to be there. I'd stand in the middle of what had been my pasture and picture the blackberry bushes, the soft dips in the ground where rainwater pooled after a storm, the spot where the sun would break through the tree line in the early morning. Those details were fading fast, swallowed up by blueprints and ambition. It occurred to me then that this was more than just a building project. It was an erasure, a rewriting of the landscape's history to suit the desires of someone who valued square footage over soil. And yet, underneath the frustration, there was a steady ember of resolve. This wasn't the first time life had tried to take something From me, I'd weathered droughts, floods, and market crashes. Those were forces of nature. This, however, was a force of arrogance, and arrogance can be dismantled. For now, I let the mansion rise. I watched every nail go in, every wall go up, every load of brick get delivered. 'Cause sometimes the best way to win a fight isn't to stop your opponent at the start. It's to let them walk so far into the wrong that they can't find their way out. And from the looks of it, the HOA president was marching herself straight into that trap. When you grow up on land, you learn that not every fight needs to be a war. Most disputes can be handled over a handshake and a cup of coffee at the kitchen table. I'd been in enough neighborly dust-ups to know that sometimes people just don't realize they've crossed a line until you point it out. So, before I let my frustration turn into something uglier, I decided to try the civil route. The first attempt was simple. I wrote a letter, not angry, not accusing, just plain and clear. I explained that the land in question was mine, that I had the deed to prove it, and that there must have been some kind of mistake. I figured it would be passed along to whoever was in charge of the construction, and we could sort it out before too much damage was done. A few days later, the letter came back in my mailbox. Same envelope, only now it had big red letters stamped. Across the front, returned to sender, not accepted. No note inside, no explanation. Just a refusal to even open it. I should have taken that as my answer right then and there, but I tried again. This time, I left a printed copy of my property. Map, highlighted in bright yellow with a friendly note attached. I stuck it in a plastic sleeve to protect it from the weather, and left it right at the edge of the gravel drive where I knew the crews would see it. By noon, it was gone. Later that day, I found it in my ditch, the plastic sleeve ripped and the papers soaked from a puddle. That was the moment I realized this wasn't about a misunderstanding. This was a performance. Every time I tried to make contact, the response or lack of one came back like a slap. I stopped by the construction site during a lunch break once, figuring I could speak directly to someone in charge. The foreman barely looked up from his clipboard before walking away. The workers followed his lead, scattering like my presence was a nuisance. It was as if they'd all been told not to speak to me the way a dog ignores a stranger when its owner is near. The black SUV kept showing up, too, and I started to notice the pattern. Every time I left something, a letter, a survey copy, a polite notice, it disappeared only after that SUV rolled in. The woman inside never got out, but I could see her watching through the tinted glass, phone in hand, as if logging every move I made. Weeks passed, and the insults became less subtle. One afternoon, I returned from town to find a row of newly planted shrubs along the gravel drive, ornamental, manicured things that looked like they belonged in the subdivision across the road, not on pasture land. They'd been planted in such a way that they lined what had once been my fence, almost like a green wall, claiming the space permanently. 2 days later, a large decorative sign appeared at the driveway entrance. It was white with gold lettering, mounted on a post capped with a polished finial. The sign read, "The Oaks Estate." My land, or at least the part they'd stolen, now had a name. A pretentious, store-bought name that dripped with the kind of self-importance only an HOA president could think was charming. I didn't need to guess who was behind it. The SUV was parked just beyond the sign when I saw it for the first time. She sat there, clipboard in her lap, sunglasses reflecting the sunlight. The message was clear. This wasn't just her project. This was her territory now. And I was trespassing in her eyes. It was strange. The way her behavior seemed designed not just to take my land, but to make me feel small in the process. Every peaceful attempt I made was treated like a joke, as if I were an annoying side character in her grand plan. She ignored my letters, my maps, my questions, and replaced them with symbols of ownership that were meant to erase me entirely. By the middle of summer, the mansion was almost complete. The roof was on, the brickwork finished, and the porch railings gleamed white in the sun. Trucks came and went, delivering furniture, boxes, and the kind of decor that would never survive a real rural storm. Landscaping crews swarmed the yard, rolling out sod like a carpet over what used to be my native grass. I kept thinking about how quickly the land's memory was being rewritten. There was no trace of the blackberry bushes now, no hint of the rough pasture I'd walked through for years. It was all being covered, polished, and renamed as if it had never belonged to anyone but her. It was tempting to lash out to cut down those shrubs, to pull up that gaudy sign, to block the drive with my tractor and see how long before she called the sheriff. But that would have been playing into her hand. She wanted me to lose my temper, to make a mistake she could use against me. So instead, I documented everything, every letter I sent, every time it was returned, every date the SUV showed up, every change made to the land. I took photos from the same vantage points every week so the timeline was clear. I made notes about the crew's behavior, the plants they installed, the exact placement of that sign. Because if there's one thing I've learned in life, it's that arrogance rarely prepares for someone who plays the long game by early fall. The final insult arrived, an actual fence. Not the kind I'd built, rough-hewn and functional, but a wrought iron thing with decorative finials, painted black to match the gate they'd installed. The gate had a keypad entry, like this was some kind of private estate in the hills instead of a hijacked pasture in rural land. That fence wasn't just meant to keep me out. It was meant to tell everyone driving by that I no longer belonged here. Standing there, looking at the glossy new gate where my old fence had stood, I realized the peace route had run its course. I'd tried letters, maps, visits, and reason. All I'd gotten in return were insults, dressed as landscaping, nameplates, and fences. She'd made one mistake, though she'd left a paper trail, whether she knew it or not. Survey records, permit filings, and property maps don't lie. And they don't change just because someone plants fancy shrubs and puts up a sign. The time for patience was over. The land might have looked different now, but underneath all the concrete, brick, and ornamental nonsense, it was still mine, and I was about to prove it in the one place where her HOA, title, and clipboard wouldn't mean a thing. The courtroom. I've never been one to enjoy courtrooms. The air in them always feels too still, like someone drained all the oxygen and replaced it with tension. But as I stepped through those heavy double doors, I realized there was no avoiding it. If I wanted my land back, this was where the fight had to happen. I'd done my homework in the months leading up to it. Every survey, every deed, every tax receipt, I had them stacked in neat order, each in a clear sleeve, labeled by year. My grandfather's voice echoed in my head. If you ever have to prove what's yours, bring the whole story, not just the ending. So I did. 2 decades of proof, printed and ready, each page telling the same truth. The 10 acres were mine. The HOA president was already there when I arrived, sitting at the polished table on the other side of the room. She wasn't wearing the sunglasses or hiding behind tinted glass today. Her hair was perfect, her blazer sharp, and her posture so straight it looked painful. Beside her sat an attorney in a navy suit, flipping through a slim folder that made me wonder if they'd underestimated me. The judge entered. The room settled into that heavy silence that only courtrooms seem to know. The opening formalities passed like the ticking of a slow clock. My attorney, a quiet, sharp-eyed man who'd been practicing longer than I'd been alive, took the lead. Starting with the basics, we began with the deed. The original, signed in thick black ink, nearly 20 years ago, was held up for the judge to see. Then came the chain of tax records, each year stamped paid in full. The survey maps were next, large sheets with bright boundary lines that matched perfectly from year to year, never shifting, never in question. When it was the HOA president's turn, her attorney launched into a speech about community expansion and perceived property lines. He painted a picture of a growing neighborhood and implied that my land had been underutilized for years. It was the kind of argument meant to sound reasonable until you actually thought about it. Then they pulled out their own map, a glossy, color-printed thing that looked more like a brochure than a legal document. On it, my southern pasture was shaded in the same color as the subdivision across the road, as if coloring it differently could make it theirs. They claimed a boundary discrepancy, citing an outdated plat from decades before I bought the place. The problem was that plat had been corrected in county records long before their subdivision even existed. My attorney let them speak, his expression as still as stone, before sliding our corrected plat across the table with the official seal in the corner. The judge took his time comparing the two. You could almost hear the weight of the evidence landing in our favor, page by page. Still, the HOA president wasn't ready to give up. She leaned forward, speaking in a tone that made the courtroom feel smaller. She said the mansion had been built in good faith, that permits had been approved, that money had been spent in reliance on those approvals. She made it sound as if the inconvenience of moving her mansion should outweigh the fact that it had been built on land she didn't own. That's when we brought out the photographs. I'd been careful to document everything: the removal of my fence, the gravel drive appearing overnight, the construction phase by phase. Each photo was dated and matched against the timeline of letters I'd sent and had returned unopened. We showed the court the day the sign went up, the planting of the shrubs, the arrival of the wrought iron fence. It wasn't just evidence of trespass, it was evidence of intent. Step by deliberate step, she'd claimed my land without so much as acknowledging my attempts to resolve it peacefully. The judge asked a few pointed questions about the permits, and it became clear that they'd been issued based on her subdivision's address and parcel information, not mine. Whether it was a clerical oversight or a carefully orchestrated maneuver, the permits had no legal standing over my acreage. Her attorney tried to pivot, suggesting that because the mansion was already built, the most practical solution was for me to sell the land to her at market value. He framed it as a generous offer. My attorney countered with the fact that the land wasn't for sale when she took it. And it still wasn't for sale now. The judge's face didn't change much during the arguments. But there was a moment, a small tightening around the eyes, when I could tell the weight of the evidence had landed. He asked for a recess to review the documents in private. Those 15 minutes stretched longer than any hour I'd ever worked in the fields. I sat there, staring at the table, running through all the possible outcomes, even with the truth on my side. You never know how the law will bend in a given room on a given day. When the judge returned, his voice was steady, almost casual, as he read the ruling. The deed, the surveys, and the tax records left no room for dispute. The land was mine. The construction had been done without my consent and without legal authority. The HOA president was ordered to vacate the property within 90 days. The structure, whether dismantled or relocated, was her problem to solve. He also awarded damages enough to cover the legal costs, the loss of use of the land, and a fine for the willful nature of the trespass. The ruling landed like the final thud of a fence post driven into the ground. My side of the room stayed quiet, but I felt the relief in my chest like the first clear breath after a long storm. The HOA president's expression never fully cracked. Her hands gave her away. The tight grip on her pen, the way her fingers flexed against the table she'd lost, and she knew it. As we left the courtroom, I caught a glimpse of her SUV pulling out of the parking lot. It looked smaller somehow, like the shine had dulled. I didn't linger to watch. My fight wasn't with her car or her posture or her pride. It was with the fact that someone thought they could erase a person's claim to their own land with nothing more than money, paperwork, and arrogance. Walking down those courthouse steps, I felt the same as I did when finishing a long day of harvest. Bone-tired? Yes. But satisfied? The work had been worth it. The proof had held. And the land, my land, was still mine. Of course, the fight wasn't completely over. 90 days is a long time, and I knew the next chapter would involve watching what she'd do with that deadline. But in that moment, with the sun on my face and the courthouse behind me, I felt the balance tip back in my favor. Some battles you win in the fields, some you win in the courtroom. And this one had been both. The 90 days came and went like the slow turning of a season. I'd been told not to expect much in the way of drama. Court orders have a way of making even the most stubborn people behave when the penalties are steep enough. Still, I made a habit of walking down to the southern boundary every week, partly to keep an eye on things, and partly because I needed to see the progress of the undoing. The first sign of movement came when the workers returned. Oh, this time they weren't in a hurry. The steady rhythm of hammers and saws was gone, replaced by the grating whine of tools tearing things apart. The mansion that had risen with such speed was now shrinking in slow, deliberate stages. Walls came down brick by brick. Porch railings were pried loose and stacked in piles. The wrought iron fence was dismantled, panel by panel, the posts leaving behind dark, empty holes in the ground. The once pristine landscaping turned ragged, with ornamental shrubs uprooted and tossed into trailers like unwanted weeds. I kept my distance, leaning on my fence post at the top of the pasture, watching them work. There was no gloating in it, just a quiet satisfaction in seeing the land reclaim itself. Nature has a way of waiting patiently for its turn. The grass had already begun creeping back into the edges of the gravel drive, blades pushing through cracks as if to remind everyone who was truly in charge here. By the end of the second month, the house was nothing but a frame again. It looked almost apologetic, stripped bare under the open sky. The workers carted off the last of the debris, and the land stood exposed. Scarred, but not broken. When the 90 days were officially up, I walked the full length of the southern pasture for the first time since this all began. The air was cool, the kind that smells faintly of turned earth and the promise of rain. My boots sank slightly into patches where the ground was still soft from where heavy equipment had sat for weeks. I paused at the spot where the decorative sign had once stood. The Oaks Estate. The post hole was still there, now half-filled with rainwater and a few floating leaves. I thought about filling it in right away, but decided to leave it for the moment. It was a reminder, a little scar in the earth that said, something happened here, and it didn't last. From there, I followed the line where my old fence had been. I ran my hand over the few posts that still stood and mentally counted how many I'd need to replace. It wasn't lost on me that rebuilding the fence would be a quieter job than tearing down a mansion. But, in its own way, it would be a bigger statement. The fence had marked my boundary long before she'd arrived, and it would do so again. Down near the tree line, I found a single brick, half buried in the dirt. It was smooth on one side, jagged on the other where it had split. I picked it up, brushed off the soil, and turned it over in my hand. Part of me considered throwing it into the woods and forgetting it. Instead, I carried it back to the barn. I wasn't sure why, maybe as a keepsake, maybe as proof, maybe just to remind myself that the fight had been real. As the weeks passed, the land began to heal. The bare earth softened, the first shoots of wild grass sprouting up in stubborn defiance of the tire tracks that had once crushed it. The wind moved freely again, no longer catching on tall walls or ornamental gates. The silence returned, but it was a richer kind of silence one earned. It's not just inherited. It wasn't just the land that changed. The subdivision across the road seemed quieter too. The black SUV stopped appearing. And I noticed that the HOA newsletter, the one they occasionally left in my mailbox by mistake, no longer carried messages from their president. Word had gotten around, as it always does in places like this. People talk. Stories spread. And the tale of the mansion on stolen land became the kind of local lore that grows taller each time it's told. One evening, as the sun was setting behind the hills, I walked the southern pasture again. The light caught the tall grass, making it sway like a golden tide. The fence line was complete now, each post standing firm in fresh-set concrete. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine, every nail, every board. Every inch of wire stretched tight against the posts. I stopped in the middle of the field and let the view settle into me. For months, that spot had been filled with noise, arrogance, and the shadow of something that didn't belong. Now it was just open space again, the way it had been for decades before. The land seemed to breathe easier, and in some strange way. So did ITHERE's a lesson in it, one I've carried with me since. Out here, you don't win by being the loudest or the fastest. You win by standing your ground, by knowing where your lines are and refusing to let anyone move them for you. The HOA president had come with her money, her crew, and her certainty that she could bend the world to fit her vision. She left with none of it. The land outlasted her. I didn't keep the victory to myself, right? I donated a stack of photocopied surveys and tax records to the local library, along with a note encouraging landowners to keep their own copies safe. Paperwork might not seem like much in the day-to-day, but in the right moment, it's stronger than concrete. As for the brick from the mansion, I set it on the fence post nearest the old gate site. It sits there now, weathering slowly, half covered in moss. It's not a trophy exactly, but it's a reminder, not just of what I fought for, but of what happens when you let arrogance convince you that ownership is just a matter of claiming something loudly enough. The seasons rolled on. Spring brought the wildflowers back to the southern pasture, and the blackberries grew thick along the fence again. I let them be. They belonged there, and they didn't need a name on a sign to prove it. Every so often, I catch sight of a car slowing down as it passes the edge of my property, the driver's eyes tracing the fence line. Maybe they've heard the story. Maybe they're just admiring the view. Either way, I don't wave them down or set them straight. The land doesn't need me to defend it every second of the day anymore. It stands on its own, as it always has. And me. I've gone back to my quiet mornings, coffee in hand, watching the sun rise over my pasture. The fight is behind me. The field is mine again, and the only sound is the wind moving through the grass. Out here, that's all the victory you need.